welcome to Culture by Neurodesign. I'm Dr. Lisa College. I'm the CEO and founder of Lisa College Consulting. And in this podcast, I talk about how investing in one inclusion initiative, cultural change that's inspired by cognitive inclusion, will lead to tens of percentages of improvements in your people metrics, think engagement, think wellness, as well as your business metrics, think innovation and quality and productivity. I'm reaching the end of a series of podcasts which I'm recording to introduce myself, since I've just launched the podcast. I've talked about my career and what motivated me to really change career direction and commit to inclusion. And in the last episode and this one, I'm talking about the process of cultural change. Last time I talked about how I de-risk cultural change, and this time what I want to do is to showcase concrete examples of how my leadership in different kinds of change has led to sustainable competitive advantage for the company. This episode is called, therefore, Driving Lasting Impact, 3 case studies of sustainable competitive advantage. I'm going to share 3 examples, as I've said. One is of a new product, one is of a framework, and one is of a culture. And what I want to do is to illustrate how some of the principles that I talked about in the last episode about de-risking cultural change have helped to bring about these changes in these various kinds of outcomes that I'm going to talk about. Changes that were advantageous to the people who were impacted by the change, as well as to the business. All right, so the first example is the example of a product. The product is called Cyval. It's still an extremely successful product for the company that I used to work at, Elsevier, and I'm going to talk about how we built Cyval. So Elsevier is a scientific, technical, and medical publisher, and it has large databases of publications which contain links between items, such as authors who have written together or who have cited each other's papers, just for a couple of examples. These databases could be used to build derivative products, derivative analytics products for research institutions. But was there a market? I mean, in order to sell a product like that, there was a massive change being asked of customers, and that change was to make more evidence-based decisions about their research. Research institutions were well used to using one metric, which had been around for decades, and it was a metric about the impact of journals that researchers published in, but not really anything else. Right? There was one metric, not lots of different metrics, and it only applied to journals. It didn't apply to research institutions or research disciplines or researchers themselves or countries as an output of research or whatever. So it was quite a big change. It wasn't quite a big change. It was a very big change that we would be asking of customers to start to use the analytics that we could provide to underpin decisions at their institutions. So the first thing that we did was to involve people from those potential customers. We got them on board in the process of designing this product. Now, it was a new venture for the company, so there were extremely extensive engagements at multiple levels of hierarchy to understand all of the different components of the particular need. In essence, we built a change story with the potential customers. I didn't call it that at the time, but now I see that that's what we were doing. Engaging in that process with customers also allowed us to see that we needed to build the skills of the users to be able to use this product that we were thinking about. We needed to educate people about what kind of questions they could answer and how. So we needed to design the product in such a way that it would help people to understand the skills that they needed and to develop the skills that they needed to use a product productively, right? We didn't want to push the answers in the product because there are so many different factors that can come into play when you think about evaluating research and making a decision, that there wasn't a one-size-fits-all answer for any question. As a simple example, what's one of my top publications? Well, what do you mean by top? Do you mean published in the most influential journals? Do you mean have received the most citations? And do you mean received the most citations this year or in lifetime? Do you mean received the most citations compared to other papers in your university or compared to other papers in your field globally? So there are lots of different ways of defining top. This is just one question. There were lots of different questions. So we couldn't tell people the answer. We had to educate them how to find the answer. And we had to educate people in the thought process that they needed to go through to get the best value out of the product. And that's how we designed the interface to help people to learn that process. It's an incredible product. It's possibly extremely complicated because you've got so much flexibility that can be offered in the product. But by engaging with the people who would use it and by really involving them and making them a part of its success, we were able to embed the education that was needed in the interface and build an incredible product. And it's still an incredible product, and it still remains a huge advantage to the company 10 years after it was launched. The second example that I want to share is related to that product, but it's not a product, it's a framework. And let me give you a little bit more background. So what that product did was mean that instead of one or perhaps two metrics being available to the people who wanted to use metrics in research institutions, suddenly lots of metrics were available. Double figures of metrics were available. And they were available for different entities, not only for journals, but for researchers or individual publications or countries or research groups. You can think of more examples, I'm sure. And they weren't only available for your research institution, but for others, so you could do benchmarking. It could have been quite overwhelming. Another difference which arose from launching that product was that the use of metrics in research really became available to people beyond those who were specialized in using research metrics. They were bibliometricians, and they had long been the kind of gatekeepers of quality decisions and advising people about how to use the information that they could draw from publications on a smaller scale and in a more specialized way. But we needed to make sure that people beyond these bibliometricians, actually people who didn't have years and years of training and experience in using metrics, were able to do so responsibly. So in a way, it was quite a risky situation. Those two factors led to a discussion in the global research community about how to use metrics responsibly. Now, if you've listened to other episodes in this podcast, you'll know that I love structure, and I am quite at home in the middle of data, and I like looking for patterns in data. So it was quite natural for me to get heavily involved in the metric side of the products. I defined them, I communicated about them. That became my specialty. I was subject matter expert in that product group who participated in these discussions. And I worked in close partnership with the research community to answer this question about how can we give advice about how to use these research metrics responsibly. But I want to highlight a different de-risking element in this case than the ones that I highlighted with building the product. In this case, I engaged with the influencers, not with the leaders of the research institutions. The leaders were on board. We had their blessing. The influencers were able to spend time on this, and it was considered important. But the leaders weren't the right people to engage in this particular question about how to use metrics responsibly. We needed people who would be using the metrics day to day, who would have to explain to people what things meant, who might have to defend their choice to use this metric and not that metric, or this benchmark and not that benchmark. This group of people who worked with were critical. They thought practically about the metrics because that was what they would have to do in their jobs. And if we built something great, they would become, and they did become, cheerleaders for the framework that we derived. They were real advocates for the framework. So they offered that on their side, and I offered, as my kind of contribution to the partnership, I offered the ability to test things, because the company that I worked for had the data and the resources to do that. I offered a global communication platform, and also offered project management. I'm an extremely good project manager. So partnering with the influencers was one way that we de-risked this situation. A second way was with the agile mindset. And let me emphasize, as I did in the last episode, I'm not talking here about the agile process. I'm talking about an agile mindset. And one of the things that I said was really useful for de-risking in the last episode of this podcast was to think about releasing units of value regularly, and that those units of value don't always need to be a product in order to be useful. They just have to be tangible. What we produced in this case was multiple elements of a framework, a concept, a practical concept. And I'm going to just give you two of the kind of core elements of that framework so that you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. One was the idea of a basket of metrics. This is actually a phrase that I heard a member of the research community use at a conference when they asked a question. Something clicked in their head and they came up with this term, and I thought it was a really great concept. So we started to use this term, basket of metrics. And what it did was to change something from being potentially overwhelming, all of these different metrics calculated for all of these different entities. It transformed that possibly overwhelming sea of metrics into something that you can carry with you in a friendly basket. Everybody has a basket. You can carry something with you in your basket, and you can dip into your basket and take things out as you need them. It made it feel like this was your tool bag instead of something that was being forced on you. And that was a really interesting concept, a unit of value that we could deliver quite easily, and it really helped a lot of people. A second example was 2 golden rules. And they were that you always, for every question, use quantitative and qualitative input. So never let your metrics replace human input, what people have observed, what people think. You need to use both together. And that the quantitative input, the metric side of the input, always has to be based on at least 2 metrics, because whichever metric you choose, one is always biased in some way or the other. So that was 2 really straightforward golden rules that also helped people to use metrics responsibly. There was more that we did as well, but I think that illustrates the approach pretty well. So that work positions the company as a leader in not only supplying metrics in a usable format in the product, but also as a provider of responsible guidelines for use of metrics. And it drove the behavior of the people using metrics globally. It was extremely successful. The third example of change that I have led, that I want to talk about in this episode, is an example of cultural change, and it's cultural change in a large department. And what I'm hoping to emphasize again with this example is that culture is something that can be just as tangible as a product. It influences just as many, probably more people than a product or a framework. And it's just as amenable to change in a designed and measured program as is a product or a framework. I think for many of us, culture may feel like a kind of vague concept that just happens to us, quite often because that's where it came from. But culture doesn't have to be that way. It can be a competitive asset that sets you apart from your competitors in a sustainable way, and you can make it tangible and measurable. So I can apply these de-risking change factors to cultural change just as well as to a product and a framework. So the example I'm going to give was of a large department that had been created by merging 3 separate groups. And those 3 separate groups had been groups for a long time. They had their own ways of doing things. They'd each been successful at serving their particular customer base. People had worked in them for a long time, and they'd built up strong relationships within those groups. And those groups were put together pretty quickly into this new large department. And you can imagine that the result was not immediately and naturally the most collaborative and productive environment. Let's put it that way. At that time, I was chief of staff of that department, and my job quickly became focused on making sure that new large department became much more collaborative, that we built respect amongst members of the group for the different skills and the different ways of doing things, right? We didn't want there to be one right way of doing things that one group had and the other 2 were wrong or silly. Everything could be good, and we wanted to build respect and interest, curiosity in what those different ways were and the experiences that people had of using those different ways. Really, we wanted to embrace the differences and achieve a high performance department. And that's another way of saying we wanted to build a cognitively inclusive culture. So there were a few de-risking factors at play here. The leader of that department was driving this initiative directly, with me very closely at their side, playing a complementary role. She set the example herself of the kind of behavior and curiosity and support of other team members that she wanted to see. She really set that example and was a role model in the department. And she very smartly also made sure that her management team received a training course at the beginning of the process, so that the management team all acted as role models. She was one role model, but with the management team, there were about 10 of us, I think, who were all showing this behavior that she wanted everybody in the department to learn and to show every day. As well as us all being role models, we were also proof of concept that the change could work. So that was a really great start. The second de-risking factor, which I'll highlight in this cultural change, was involving people. We went on a listening tour, and we listened to a lot of complaints, as you can imagine, in the situation that the people had been put in by that rapid merger of 3 groups. And we played it back to the group, show them that we were listening, and we used it to create a change story. Everybody was bought in because everybody had given us the material for the change story, and nobody was really happy. They wanted to improve things and they wanted to enjoy their work again. So this was a great way to get people involved, and that was the common purpose, that in that situation it was quite easy to get people motivated behind. More of a challenge was building trust that this wasn't just something that we were doing for 3 months, that it actually was going to be a long-term investment. And building that trust was done by consistently showing that behavior of listening, sharing back, showing how the information that had been received was reflected in the plan and in changes in the plan. That was how we built trust, in consistently showing that we were doing this. We talked about this initiative in every meeting, so it obviously wasn't going away. It was obviously seen as a very significant commitment from the management team that we spent most of our meetings working on. It was pretty clear to people that we were genuine and that they could start to trust. The last de-risking factor that I will highlight for this cultural change is the idea of extending the concept of leadership. So I've already mentioned that the leader was personally driving this, with me closely at her side with a complementary role, and she rolled it out to her management team so that the role models in leadership who were exemplifying the behavior that she wanted were expanded. As well as that management team, we formally created an extended management team, right? And they were that was the next layer in the hierarchy, who reported to the management team, and they were given a role, a pretty important role. They needed to communicate bidirectionally, so explain the reasons for decisions, help people to understand why decisions were taken if people hadn't understood it in the department-wide meetings that we were running. They needed to help people to understand why things were going on, help make sure that people felt confident about what was going on, but also collect feedback and feed it back into the management team, so that could be considered in the planning and whether we needed to adjust the planning. That cultural change was exceptionally successful. People, even before we really put the significant changes in place that we were working towards in terms of organization and some changes in job roles, people were happier. Even knowing that those changes in the organization and job roles were coming up, they were happier. And it didn't matter whether we measured it in terms of their engagement, their satisfaction, or the employee net promoter score, the eNPS, they all went up like crazy. In addition, the contribution of that department to the business success also measurably improved. So I'm going to leave it there. I've highlighted in this episode 3 examples of change that I've led, significant change. 1, product-driven change. 1, framework-based change. And 3rd, a cultural change. And what I wanted to do was to share examples of how the factors that can de-risk change that I described in the last episode, how they played in these change initiatives in building a sustainable competitive advantage for the business in putting these change initiatives in place. Next time, I'm going to talk about what it's like to work with me. And in the meantime, I'll say thank you for listening.